Second part. A full day later, many different colors of lamps rocked in time to mirthful voices in the depths of the night. The music of a fairly accomplished band was overlaid with the singing of rustic men and women. This was Lawless Years, an entertainment district out in the wilderness. Even on the frontier, densely populated areas were favored as more comfortable environs, the exception being towns that were constructed in mobile locations, as the pieces of movable property were known. But out in the wasteland where not so much as a tree or blade of grass grew, the eyes of many far-ranging travelers would pop at suddenly spotting an entertainment district there, strung with endless lights and bathed in music. Just as oases existed in the desert, out in the wilderness people gathered in search of water, oil, and tonics. In the case of Lawless Years, they discovered springs containing countless minerals and a rejuvenating substance that defied analysis. Then spent the next 3 centuries or so delivering their spring water not only around the frontier, but to the capital itself in a huge mobile factory, all the while singing the praises of the prosperity to be found out in the deadly, wind-churned wasteland. True to its name, there was no law there, though there was a sheriff. He was strictly a figurehead in charge of cleaning up the corpses. That night, trouble in the saloons had already seen 3 dead and 7 more hospitalized. Those responsible, of course, were back gambling without a care in the world, while no one knew the identity of the 3 slain. The altercation had taken place at a cat house on the town's main thoroughfare. A hooker who was a favorite of the employees of the waterworks was being monopolized by a group of prospectors from a nearby mine, and the disagreement about whether or not they would turn her over brought out the blades. True to form, the sheriff and his deputies only arrived on the scene after the fight was over. The dead and injured were carried out. The blood was wiped up off the floor, and as always, that should have been the end of it. And then a certain man came. With the smell of blood and a sense of slaughter still heavy in the air, he stood in the foyer and demanded they bring out their prettiest girl. Judging from his enormous size, the way his eyes and mouth were nearly buried in the flesh of his face, his manner, and his tone, the madam figured he was no ordinary drifter, and tried to satisfy him with the most presentable of her unoccupied girls. When the girl came out, the man sent her flying. The bouncers raced in, only to have both arms dislocated in a flash, at which point the man repeated his demand for their top girl, this time by name. From amid the women and customers watching the situation as if to say, "Again?" One girl stepped to the fore. This was the girl the man had requested. She told the panicked madam, "I'm sick of the same old customers every time. I want this one." In a voice like the winter wind blustering from a cavern, the giant said, "Sure do speak your mind, don't you? I've heard stories about you, and always wanted to look you up. I'm on a job at the moment, but figured I'd blow off a little steam." "A pleasure," the girl replied, looking up at the customer with no small amount of seductive power in her eyes. The customer was nearly 6.5 feet tall, and seemed almost as wide. A number of what looked to be weights hung from the belt of his long robe, seemingly odd accessories. That night, the cat house was apparently a magnet for trouble. As the pair was about to go upstairs, the miners who'd prevailed in the earlier brawl surrounded them. They had been the girl's customers that night. As the men suggested, they take it out back, and their eyes were already bloodshot. The customer was going to step out alone, but the girl said, "Okay," and clung to his arm. On glimpsing the peaceful expression on the beautiful face, beneath her heavy makeup, anyone would have become obsessed with a certain notion. Though the madam screamed and shouted, it did nothing to change the situation, and the pair and 10 thugs started to leave the establishment. Suddenly the giant halted and asked, "Missy, you want to see this cat house knocked flat?" The girl smiled thinly. "Sure, that'd be great." Her smile froze when she saw the giant's grinning face. He couldn't be serious. "My name's Quake Resden. Remember it." And saying that, the giant looked around at the miners. The moonlight gave a vicious gleam to the steel blades, long sword-sized machetes and javelins. Their weapons certainly had variety to them. "Hop on my back," Resden told the girl, raising his right leg up by his side. It was unclear if any of the spectators realized this was the sort of a leg stomp a sumo wrestler performed. "Here we go." The instant he brought his foot down, the ground thudded noisily. Astonishment spread across the faces of all but Resden. The lamps and electric lights adorning the building's eaves swayed back and forth. "I might be big, but I was born with awful balance, you see," Resden said with a grin. Though his mouth and eyes were hidden by plump wads of flesh, it was obvious that he was smiling. He touched his hands to the weights around his waist. "To stand up or walk straight, I've needed these since I was a kid. Now all told, they're a ton." The girl on his back bugged her eyes. Not only the miners, but even the spectators went pale. Way back in the day they were lighter, but I got used to them, and as I was going about my business something strange happened. This. His other foot rose, and when it came down, this time the earth most definitely shook. The girl on his back let out a shriek, and people reeled regardless of where they were in town. "Okay, come at me, you hole-digging dipshits." The roughest of the miners rose to his bait. His weapon was a great scythe. Gore from the waterworks employee he'd stabbed to death still clung to it. Raising it high, the miner charged forward, but suddenly the ground before him opened its maw. Resden had planted his right foot, and the crack had raised from beneath the sole of his shoe. Sunk waist deep, the miner planted his hands on either side of the split and tried to pull himself back out. Reston raised one leg. Don't do it. To the accompaniment of the miners' cries, the crack closed. The miner's upper body toppled backward to face the sky, fresh blood gushing from his nose and mouth. Bad news, we've had a casualty. And when that happens, the aftershocks continue for a while. Reston gave them a smile, with those indiscernible eyes and lips, and his words must have had a disturbing ring to them. Because the rest of the miners then screamed and turned their backs to him. Before they'd gone 3 paces, the madly shaking ground threw the man like a bucking horse, and the deadly mouth that snarled open swallowed them. Desperately reaching out for life, several of the men's hands were left sticking from the cracks when they brutally closed. People frozen in shock from witnessing these horrible deaths couldn't help feeling like they were bound to the victims by invisible chains. And once again the giant did a sumo foot stomp, and a fierce tremor assailed the town. Buildings crumbled like papier-mâché, and the first to go was the cat house. The customers and girls inside were ruthlessly dispatched by the crushing weight of the beams and roof. The only one able to frame her thoughts was the girl on Reston's back. Stop it, stop it. What are you crying about? Asked the man. I squashed the place you hated, and the madam. Now let's go somewhere and have ourselves some fun. How on earth could I do that? Quit it already. Are you out to ruin the town? Even the factories. Yeah, if you're gonna do something, you've gotta do it whole hog, I figure. For him, this destruction might merely have been an opportunity to display his power, because he continued striking his limbs against the ground, and in less than 2 minutes lawless years as 3 centuries of history were reduced to rubble. What do you say? Feels good, right? Reston said boastfully, while on his back the girl sobbed. Okay, let's go. We'll have our fun in the nearby woods. The giant turned around and headed for the one safe spot, the hitching post where he tethered his cyborg horse. 5 minutes at a gallop, and they were close to the woods. Leaving the road, Reston rode in on the cyborg horse. You know, it's not that I mind camping, but isn't this dangerous? The girl inquired, being well aware of how terrible a forest could be by night. Lands of trees and vines where man-eating plants were commonplace, and supernatural beasts and monsters roamed. They were ominous places where humans feared to tread. Actually, it does run contrary to my nature. See, it really reduces the effectiveness of my power. But if I'm going to have some fun with you, I think doing it on a bit of grass would be better. I may not look it, but I'm real big on chivalry. Thanks, the girl said, shrugging her shoulders. To be sure, it was thanks to this man that she'd escaped that hellish gallows. She'd witnessed his terrible power with her own eyes. However, now that she was free, she found the man's ultra-violent actions and the fact that his conscience allowed him to commit them so impassively a disturbing thought. In short, he was now a hindrance. Soon after entering the woods, Reston found a clearing and dismounted, and the girl followed his lead. "I'm cold," she said, pulling close the front of the coat Reston had loaned her. Perhaps that bit about him being chivalrous was actually on the mark. But in this case, the coldness she felt was due to nervousness and the atmosphere of the woods. "I'll get the portable hangar going," said Reston, "but there's a better way to get warmed up." Fighting back an expression that would have read, here we go, the girl quickly donned a smile. At any rate, she was in his debt for getting her out of the loathsome establishment. Also, he'd provided the protection she needed until she reached another town. The heater he'd set on the ground began to glow red as it generated heat. "It's warm, but won't the stoneflies come if you leave it going?" Those were monstrous insects, as big as your thumb, and they came flying at insane speeds whenever they saw fire. Just buzzing in would have been bother enough, but they would heat themselves to blistering temperatures, then explode. This presented a real problem for people and livestock in the vicinity. A stonefly's body was encased in a carapace as hard as stone, pieces of which could cause grave injuries when they scored a solid hit. Though that was still better than the not infrequent cases of instantaneous death. "It's okay. You can put your mind at ease." In saying that, Reston raised one knee. He'd been sitting cross-legged. The ground must have shaken from the same power that had leveled lawless years. No sooner had the girl noticed an irritating buzzing in her ears, than something angled down to strike the ground. On seeing the black shape that had stopped moving soon after impact, she said, "But that, it's a stonefly." "Yeah. My power doesn't just work on the ground. It shakes up the air, too. Not a problem for people, but for bugs like stoneflies, this shock is like getting hit with a tornado. See how handy I can be?" "Yeah. But one bug's not going to do much. Stoneflies form swarms when they attack, don't they?" "You really don't know anything, do you?" Reston chatted. "What's that crack supposed to mean?" the woman asked sulkily. "Stoneflies, you see, are like a kind of hive mind. First, they send out a couple dozen scouts to find the target, and see just how dangerous it is. These act as eyes. If any one of them gets smushed, all the rest know about it. Now, when a person gets one of his eyes poked out, you think he wants to go anywhere near the guy who did it. The stoneflies won't come near us again." The girl let out a relieved breath. "Good," she said. The man's hands took hold of her shoulders. "What, so soon? Something wrong with that? I happen to be your savior. It's only natural you give me my reward." "Right." Reston's lips pressed against the girl's. At that moment, the two of them flew apart, the way two similarly charged magnets would. Page break, indicated by a small cross. The second part, end.